Nazeera Qistina was the perfect bride, elegant, soft-spoken, and mysterious. Zaim was the respected groom, charming, religious, and proud. But within 24 hours of their wedding, one secret would turn devotion into rage and transform their marital home into a crime scene. Asterisk in the shaded alleys of Kuala Lumpur's suburban enclave of Ampang, a modest wedding was unfolding beneath the golden afternoon sun. Guests gathered inside a small hall decorated with strings of jasmine and flickering fairy lights. There was no fanfare, no celebrity presence, just a quiet, respectful gathering of close family and a handful of friends. At the center of it all stood Zaim, the groom, a 33-year-old businessman known locally for his soft-spoken demeanor and frequent donations to the mosque. He wore a crisp white baju Melayu, his smile steady as he greeted well-wishers and elders with customary kisses on the hand. Beside him stood Nazeera Qistina, a vision of serenity. Draped in an elegant ivory lace hijab, her eyes lowered beneath long lashes, she barely spoke during the ceremony. Her presence was like a painting, beautiful but unreadable. She came from another state, had no immediate family present, except for a distant aunt, and held herself with a kind of practiced grace that made some whisper and wonder. But no one dared to ask too many questions. The nikah was performed swiftly by Ustaz Halim Farouk, a respected cleric who remarked on how pure and God-fearing the couple seemed. The marriage documents were signed with ink and formality, and just like that, Haris and Nazeera were husband and wife. Photos were taken, prayers were made, and the bride and groom were ushered into a decorated car surrounded by sparklers and flower petals. They arrived at Haris's home just before sunset. A 2-story residence nestled in a sleepy street lined with frangipani trees and quiet neighbors. His mother had passed years ago, and the house now stood as a symbol of his independence, a home waiting for a family. He opened the door for his new bride and guided her inside. Neighbors peeked through their windows, smiling at the sight of a newlywed couple stepping into their future. But behind that closed door, a strange silence quickly settled. Nazeera moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to touch too much or make noise. Haris, at first warm, began observing her with increasing intensity, watching the way she moved, how she responded to touch, how she answered questions. There was a growing coldness behind his eyes, a twitch of something unspoken. The next day, Haris didn't leave the house. No one saw them step outside, and even the lights stayed off longer than usual. It was mid-morning when the first unusual sounds began. Thuds, something like furniture being pushed, a loud, angry bang against the wall. Then came silence again, unnerving and hollow. By late afternoon, a neighbor named Puan Saida, an elderly widow who lived across the street, called the police. She claimed she'd seen Haris standing on his porch earlier, barefoot and shaking, his white shirt stained in dark patches that looked like blood. She saw him speaking to himself, pacing with his hands on his head. Then he disappeared back inside. When officers arrived, Haris opened the door slowly. His face was pale, eyes red and unfocused. He didn't resist arrest, nor did he ask why they were there. He simply pointed upstairs. That's where they found Nazeera lying motionless in the bedroom, face bruised, lip split, one eye swollen shut. Her hands were tied with a scarf, and her breathing was shallow but present. Near her body lay torn documents, a marriage certificate, and what looked like hospital records. Officers could see the fragments of something that had gone terribly wrong. When paramedics rushed Nazeera to the hospital, they found a message scribbled in weak handwriting on a piece of gauze tucked under her arm. It read, "I told the truth." But too late. What had begun as a traditional union, celebrated under God's name, had disintegrated into violence within 24 hours. No one yet knew what truth Nazeera had revealed, but whatever it was, it had turned a wedding into a crime scene and left a trail of shattered illusions in its wake. The morning after the wedding, the neighborhood was gripped by a strange quietness. Word had already spread that something had gone wrong at Zaim's house, though no one knew exactly what. Police tape now surrounded the gate, and officers stood watch as crime scene investigators moved in and out. The once celebrated newlywed home had turned into a house of horror overnight. Inside the master bedroom, forensic technicians documented the scene. Blood was smeared on the corner of a wooden wardrobe. A cracked vanity mirror reflected the chaos overturned. Furniture, torn bedding, and scattered personal items. In the corner, a crushed bouquet of jasmine flowers lay beneath a blood-stained slipper. The soft scent of perfume still hung faintly in the air, clashing against the sharp metallic tang of violence. Nazeera had been found barely alive. She was rushed to Ampang General Hospital in critical condition. Her injuries included multiple contusions on the face and arms, cracked ribs, and internal bruising. Doctors confirmed that the trauma was consistent with repeated blunt force. Her condition was stabilized, but she remained unconscious. Her only communication had been the cryptic note she managed to write before collapsing. It puzzled everyone. I told the truth, but too late. At the police station, Zaim sat silently in an interrogation room. He hadn't resisted arrest, nor did he make any effort to contact a lawyer. He stared blankly at the floor, muttering prayers under his breath. When questioned, he offered a vague and unsettling explanation. He had been deceived. In his words, I was made to believe she was something she's not. It's not just betrayal. It's a sin in disguise. The statement raised more questions than answers. What kind of deception could provoke such brutal violence in less than a day of marriage? Why did he use the word sin? Investigators began combing through Nazeera's belongings, hoping to uncover any hidden truths. In her suitcase, they found makeup, modest clothing, and a small Quran. But hidden in a zipped compartment were older documents, medical files, discharge notes from a private clinic, and name change affidavits. The documents revealed that Nazeera Qistina had previously gone by a different name, Nur Ayman. Though born biologically male, she had undergone gender transition over the past several years. Her legal gender was now marked female, and her appearance aligned completely with her lived identity. She had started a new life in the city, far from the judgment and fear that had followed her in her hometown. When Haris discovered these documents, according to police timelines, it was late at night. The house was quiet. Nazeera had gone to sleep early, exhausted from the long day. Haris, perhaps rummaging through her bag for some benign reason, found the truth he had not anticipated. What followed was not an emotional conversation or a silent confrontation. It was immediate violence. He beat her with a belt, a shoe, and later, his bare fists. Despite his actions, Haris tried to justify his behavior through religious language. He claimed that marriage required trust, and that what had happened was a divine punishment. But his narrative lacked remorse. He never expressed concern for Nazeera's condition, only shame for how his honor had been stained. News of the incident began to leak into the media. Social platforms erupted with divided opinions. Some defended Haris, saying he had a right to know everything about his partner. Others stood in support of Nazeera, calling the attack an inexcusable act of hate-fueled violence. The nation found itself wrestling with deep-rooted issues: gender identity, cultural conservatism, and the limits of justice. At the hospital, Nazeera remained unconscious in the ICU. Doctors reported that she might survive, but full recovery was uncertain. The psychological wounds, they feared, would cut deeper than the physical. Meanwhile, police prepared charges against Haris for attempted murder and aggravated assault. The case was no longer just about a violent husband. It was about a society forced to confront what it never dared speak of. Hidden truths had surfaced, and now the question echoed across newsrooms, prayer halls, and households. Was the victim guilty of deception, or was she simply punished for being who she was? The days following the brutal attack revealed a life that Nazeera Qistina had carefully constructed, one built on resilience, secrecy, and survival. As investigators delved into her past, a portrait began to emerge, not of deception, but of a woman who had spent her entire life trying to find a place in a world that never accepted her. Nazeera had been born in the small, conservative town of Temerloh under the name Nuraiman. From a very young age, those around her noticed she did not behave like other boys. She was quiet, gentle, and preferred the company of her mother and older sisters. As she grew, her discomfort in her assigned gender became more visible. Family members grew impatient, teachers punished her for feminine behavior, and neighbors gossiped behind her back. Her father disowned her when she was just 16, calling her a disgrace to their faith and bloodline. With nowhere to turn, Nazeera left Temerloh and moved to Kuala Lumpur. The city was bigger, colder, but more anonymous. She found shelter in a rented room and worked long hours at a tailoring shop to pay for food and basic needs. Over time, she met a small community of others who, like her, existed on the margins, people who didn't fit the boxes society forced upon them. At 21, she began her transition in secret. She sought hormone therapy from underground clinics. At first, until she was able to connect with a private physician who understood her situation. It was a long and emotionally painful process. She faced harassment during hospital visits, was turned away from jobs, and often had to move from place to place to avoid threats. But through it all, she remained focused on one goal: to live a life that felt true to who she was. Her friend and confidant, Puteri Nazeera, played a critical role in her journey. They met at a support group meeting in Cheras, and Puteri, a medical student at the time, helped Nazeera navigate the legal side of her transition. With Puteri's help, Nazeera successfully changed her name and gender marker on her official documents. She began presenting herself as Nazeera Qistina, fully embracing her new identity. Despite the progress she made, Nazeera remained cautious about revealing her past. She feared rejection, violence, and being outed in a society that was often hostile toward the transgender community. Even in her daily life, she kept things private: no social media, no close contact with neighbors, and no dating until she was absolutely sure she could trust someone. Then came Zaim. They met in a charity bazaar where Nazeera was working at a modesty wear stall. Haris was polite, reserved, and seemed genuinely interested in her. Their relationship was brief but intense. He visited her at work, brought her meals, and introduced her as someone special to a few friends. He was religious but not aggressively and spoke often about finding a good, faithful woman to settle down with. Nazeera felt conflicted. For the first time, she considered the possibility of marriage a life of normalcy, love, and stability. But the fear of revealing her history gnawed at her constantly. She rehearsed the moment in her head countless times. How would he react? Would he walk away quietly, or would he turn violent? And if she didn't tell him, would it be a betrayal? In the end, she made a decision rooted in hope. She told herself that she would tell Haris the truth after the wedding, once they had shared some time together, once he had seen how much she loved him. She believed that perhaps then he would understand, that he would still see her as his wife. But that opportunity never came. The truth was discovered by force, not by choice. The medical documents Haris found were old, buried deep in her luggage, kept more as reminders of how far she had come than as something to hide. But to Haris, they were a declaration of dishonor, a violation, a betrayal that demanded punishment. Now, as Nazeera lay silent in the ICU and the world pieced together her story, the truth came to light, not the one Haris wanted to believe, but the one Nazeera had lived every single day of her life, a truth of courage, endurance, and quiet dignity in the face of relentless judgment. Zaim's initial portrayal as a betrayed, and broken man began to fracture the moment investigators examined the timeline of his actions. The narrative he tried to control, that he had acted out of shock and religious outrage, crumbled under the weight of forensic evidence and psychological analysis. What unfolded instead was a portrait of a man obsessed with control, image, and power, who responded to his own internal fragility with violence. The items recovered from the bedroom were not only medical records but included old photographs, a diary, and signed affidavits confirming Nazeera's transition and legal name change. These were personal documents, hidden away, never intended to harm anyone. Yet Haris treated them as weapons proof, in his eyes, of something shameful and deceptive. According to investigators, the attack on Nazeera was not spontaneous. There was a calculated sequence of events. After making the discovery, Haris had not stormed out or called family. Instead, he remained in the house for hours, pacing, fuming, and finally entering the bedroom with violent purpose. It was this deliberate response that stood out most to Inspector Deng Rizal. He noted that Haris hadn't acted out of confusion, but had locked the bedroom door behind him. He ensured no one would interrupt him. This wasn't panic, it was premeditated rage. The attack was systematic, hitting her with blunt objects, kicking her ribs, tearing the very wedding dress she had worn just a day before. What disturbed the forensics team was the lack of remorse afterward. Haris didn't attempt to help her. He didn't call for an ambulance. He left her there, alone and broken, as if punishing her was all that mattered. By the time police arrived, his hands were still stained with blood, his face eerily calm. He offered no defense, only repeating that a sin had been committed in his home. The court ordered a psychological evaluation. Dr. Amir Hadi, a forensic psychologist, spent several sessions with Haris and identified deep-rooted narcissistic traits. Haris had spent years crafting a public image devout, generous, respectable. To him, marriage was not just companionship. It was a symbol of his social status and masculinity. Nazeera, unknowingly, had become part of that image. She was beautiful, soft-spoken, modest, everything Haris believed reflected well on him. But when that illusion shattered, when he discovered that her identity defied what he had assumed, it cracked something inside him. Not because she had harmed him, but because his pride had been wounded. Dr. Hadi noted that Haris viewed the world in black and white, men and women, right and wrong, holy and sinful. Anything that challenged that binary was seen as a threat. The irony was bitter. Nazeera had never lied to him. She had simply not told him everything. But her truth didn't fit into Haris's tightly controlled world. Her past, which she had every right to own, became the spark that exposed his fragility. He chose violence not to protect his beliefs, but to punish someone for making him feel powerless. Meanwhile, Nazeera's recovery was slow. Though she eventually regained consciousness, the trauma had changed her. She barely spoke to anyone. Doctors noted signs of post-traumatic stress, frequent nightmares, avoidance of mirrors, long periods of silence. Her friend, Puteri Nazera, visited often, holding her hand, reading from the Quran, reminding her of her strength. Public reaction was sharply divided. Some conservative voices insisted Haris had been tricked and deserved sympathy. Others pointed out that nothing justified such brutality. Advocacy groups rallied behind Nazeera, demanding better legal protections for the transgender community, whose existence was often treated as taboo. Haris's actions exposed something darker than a failed marriage. They revealed how deeply society clings to roles, labels, and appearances. When someone dares to challenge that, the backlash can be violent. But in exposing that darkness, Nazeera's story also ignited a conversation Malaysia had long avoided. Her survival wasn't just physical, it became symbolic. She had endured years of discrimination, rejection, and fear. And even though her truth led her into unimaginable pain, it also sparked a reckoning. Zaim tried to silence her, But instead, her story echoed louder than ever. Asterisk. The trial of Hari Zaim began 3 months after the attack. By then, Nazeera Qistina had made a fragile physical recovery, though the emotional damage was far from healed. She arrived at court in a wheelchair, her face pale but composed, flanked by her legal team and her close friend, Puteri Maizura. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse, capturing the image of a woman whose identity had become the center of a national storm. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and divided. Protesters and supporters gathered outside every day, some holding placards condemning deception in marriage, others raising signs that read, "Trans rights are human rights." Religious figures debated publicly about whether Nazeera's gender identity could be accepted under Islamic law. Politicians remained largely silent, unwilling to wade into such a polarizing issue. Hari sat in the defendant's box, still wearing the same cold expression he had when first arrested. His legal team argued that he was a victim of emotional distress, that he had reacted impulsively upon discovering his wife's past. They tried to frame the case as a cultural misunderstanding, leaning heavily on religious interpretations and societal norms, but the prosecution was prepared. They presented clear evidence photos of Nazeera's injuries, hospital reports, the blood-stained documents found in the bedroom, and the disturbing testimony from forensic psychologist Dr. Amir Hadi. His analysis made it clear that Haris did not act in a fit of momentary rage. The attack had been prolonged, violent, and deliberate. Inspector Deng Rizal took the stand, recounting the crime scene in chilling detail. He emphasized the sequence of events, the lack of remorse, and Haris's disturbing composure afterward. The court listened silently as he described the way Nazeera was left unconscious, bound and bleeding, while Haris simply waited for the world to come to him. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when Nazeera chose to speak. Though her voice trembled, she looked directly at the judge as she described the events of that night, not in detail, but enough to convey the horror she endured. She spoke not of revenge, but of the right to live as herself without fear. Her statement ended with a sentence that moved the courtroom into complete silence. If telling the truth meant I deserved to be beaten, then what does that say about all of us? The verdict came after 3 weeks of testimony. Haris was found guilty of attempted murder and aggravated assault. The judge dismissed the defense's claims of emotional instability and cultural confusion, declaring that no law, tradition, or belief justified what had been done. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison. The decision was celebrated by human rights groups and condemned by hardliners. Yet it marked a rare moment in Malaysian legal history, a case that publicly acknowledged gender identity, personal safety, and the right to live without violence. After the trial, Nazera disappeared from the public eye. Puteri Maizura later revealed that she had left the country under a protection program. The threats against her had not stopped, even after Haris was jailed. But in her absence, Nazeera's story continued to grow. University seminars referenced her case in discussions on gender rights. Activist groups used her name as a rallying cry for inclusion. Her short memoir, I Was a Bride, Not a Lie, published anonymously, sold thousands of copies within weeks. Though she had no intention of becoming a symbol, she had become one. Anyway, a quiet, dignified reminder of how painful and powerful truth can be. And Hari Zaim? He remained behind bars, mostly isolated. Once seen as a respected figure, his name was now synonymous with cruelty and shame. His downfall became a cautionary tale about pride, masculinity, and the cost of violence. What began as a simple wedding, celebrated with flowers and faith, ended in a courtroom that forced an entire nation to face its own prejudice. In the process, Nazeera Qistina didn't just survive, she changed the conversation. Asterisk.